Microphone working. Excellent. Okay, well, good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for coming. It's wonderful to see such a great crowd, and thank you to Alan and the Vice-Chancellor for such a lovely introduction. I'm going to have to make sure I don't bump into that thing, aren't I? Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about sex and gender and all of the messy stuff that goes in amongst that. And you know, as humans, we are deeply obsessed with issues of sex and gender, so obsessed, in fact, that people who transgress the social norms with respect to those things are often punished by death, even today. So it's a big issue. Nevertheless, with advancements in modern medical science, making it possible for people to transition through genders more easily, and also with advancements in the law, digging us slowly out of the dreadful pit that our Victorian ancestors have got us into, we are seeing more and more people moving across gender boundaries. And inevitably, writers of fiction have taken a look at this and thought about it. And writers of speculative fiction, of course, have said, well, how is this going to happen? How is this going to develop in the future? And that's what this talk is all about. There's a fair amount of stuff to cover, so I'm going to run through it all relatively quickly, but I'm sure the slides will be available somewhere or other. I also like to mention that because I'm doing this on the fly and fairly quickly, the terminology might slip a little occasionally. I won't be as careful and nuanced as I would in a blog post, so apologies to any trans people if I manage to slip up along the way. So probably the best place to start is back in ancient Greece. And this person here is Tiresias. He was a priest of Apollo, and one day he came upon a couple of snakes busy making baby snakes, and for some reason or other decided to strike them with a stick. Unfortunately for him, these snakes were sacred to the goddess Hera, and she took against him because of this and punished him by turning him into a woman. And he lived as a woman apparently for seven years. Now, it's not entirely clear what the point of this myth is, but I think one of the reasons for it was to allow the Greeks to explore that age-old question of who has a better life, men or women. And in particular, there's one story about Tiresias where Zeus and Hera come and interrogate him. Apparently, Zeus has been making up excuses for his philandering. And he's explained to Hera that women have much more fun in sex than men do, and he has to make up for his lack of quality by lots and lots of quantity. So they come and see Tiresias and they ask him, you've done it both ways, who has more fun out of sex, is it men or women? And Tiresias thinks for a little bit and he says, yeah, women, definitely, about 9 to 1. Now, there are many ways in which you can interpret that. Possibly Tiresias was more afraid of Zeus than he was of Hera. Possibly he was telling the truth. Or possibly the story was told by somebody who was trying to make up excuses for his own philandering. We can't tell. But there it is. That's the start of people looking at gender changes in what approximates fantasy fiction. Of course, things have changed quite a lot since then. You know, for about 2,000 years, there wasn't terribly much doing with this stuff. We have a few honourable exceptions with things like Orlando by Virginia Woolf. And of course, there were lots and lots of people making eunuchs. And eunuchs, if you think about it, are actually a form of gender reassignment. It's surgery, and also because they remove the testes, it's a primitive form of hormone treatment. But most people wouldn't have classed eunuchs as women. They might have classed them as a third gender. In fact, many cultures did. But it wasn't really until the early part of the 20th century that medical science invented plastic surgery and also understood what hormones did and therefore were able to apply them in a structured and scientific manner. And here are just a few examples of famous trans people from history. We have Lily Elba, whom we believe to be the first male to female transsexual. There's a film being made about her life, starring Eddie Redmayne, which is going to be out, I think, later this year, possibly early next. Michael Dillon, the first complete female-to-male transsexual. Christian Jorgensen, the one that the newspapers always say is the first because she was the one who had the big media splash. And finally, of course, Liverpool's own April Ashley, who is the subject of that wonderful exhibition in the Museum of Liverpool over the past year or so. and who was a great inspiration to me in my teenage years. Thank you, April. Now, of course, science fiction writers will look at this and they'll say, how will this play out in the future? If we can do it, surely it will become better, it will become easier, it will become cheaper, and everyone will be doing it. And that's more or less the subject of John Varley's novel Steel Beach, in that in Varley's novel, changing gender is something like you do like changing careers. You spend a few years as a man, and you're kind of bored with that, you decide you want to try something different, so you become a woman instead. But Varley's ideas of gender were really quite primitive. And basically he thought that people would either be macho men or they would be girlies, and pretty much nothing in between. Apart from the fact if they were gay, in which case they would be gay men and they would become lesbian women. He was terribly essentialist about that. So it didn't really bear much resemblance to the realities of trans life. He did also try to answer the question of who has more fun, men or women, and at the end of the book his character Hildy decides that it's much more fun to be a woman as long as you don't have to give up your penis, which is pretty much what you would expect a man to say. Now, before I go any further, I should probably say a little bit about what we mean by trans, but of course we really don't know. I mean, we know that there are people who have feelings about their genders, but scientifically we don't know too much about it. Historically, we can point to societies in which there's been a lot more gender variance than we have now, where it's been more culturally accepted, and slowly but surely in Western so-called civilization we're getting back to that point. Scientific evidence for a biological origin of gender identity is beginning to mount up, but we certainly don't have anything close to a mechanism as yet. And we know that trans identities are much more complicated than was originally thought back in the 20th century. The whole idea of the man trapped in a woman's body is now a hideous and outdated cliche that we need to bin. And of course we also mustn't forget that there are intersex people. There are many people amongst us whose bodies have very easily identifiable biological features of both genders. While I'm on the subject, I should also mention I'll be using the word cis, which means the opposite of trans. It's Latin, so shorthand, please don't throw anything at me. Right, now, when we are talking about books about gender switching, the first thing that people tend to think of in a science fiction context is The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin. You know, cis people will come up to me and say, what a great book about trans people that is. And I will look at them and say, what? Because the aliens in this book, the Gathenians, change gender naturally as part of their life cycle. Le Guin was presumably aware that there are species of fish and frogs and so on that do this in our world, and she hypothesized that it would be possible to have aliens that did it as well. So they're not really trans people. There's certainly no question of gender dysphoria, there's no question of transgressing social norms or anything like that. The point at which it becomes a book about trans people is because Le Guin takes this society with these aliens and dumps a standard binary gendered Earth person down in the middle of it. Well, this is Genli I. He's an ambassador to this planet, and for most part he's like perfectly okay. He doesn't really understand what's going on. And he befriends one of the aliens, somebody called S-Raven. And during the plot, as these things happen, they're fleeing for their lives, and they get stuck out on an ice shelf on a sled in the middle of a snowstorm. And at this point, S-Raven starts to change from being a male Gathenian to a female Gathenian. And poor old Genli is completely discombobulated by this, because the chap that he thought was his best mate that they were having this terribly manly adventure with is now a rather attractive female. So what Le Guin is actually doing here is not writing about trans people themselves, but writing about the reaction that cis people have to somebody changing genders. And from that point of view, it's really quite interesting. Genli, being a diplomat, doesn't react terribly badly. He doesn't fly into a murderous rage, as quite often happens in our world. But the idea is there. It is perhaps a book about trans panic. Now, there are all sorts of different genders that aliens could have, and here are a couple of examples from feminist science fiction. In the Aleutian trilogy, starting with White Queen, Gwyneth Jones has a bunch of aliens arrive on Earth, and the aliens only have one gender. And they happen to be sexually attractive to both male and female humans, and this causes an awful lot of confusion, particularly with people who are hung up about possibly being gay. And that's that's an interesting examination of a whole bunch of feminist things. Not a lot to do with trans people, apart from the fact that when Jones wrote these books, pretty much nobody knew about non-binary people. And now non-binary people are popping up all over the place. And it'll be interesting to see whether they have the same sort of effect on human society as Gwyneth Jones' aliens. The other book I've mentioned here, Halfway Human, by Caroline Eves Gilman, it's a book about feminism. Her aliens have no gender as children, and when they go through puberty, some of them become male and some of them become female, but others remain ungendered and are known as blanks. And what Gilman is doing here is taking a pop at the feminist idea of going out, having a career, becoming successful and powerful just like a man. Because she says, hang on a minute, somebody will still have to look after the children. Somebody has to do the cooking and cleaning. So in her world, it's the blanks who are the second-class citizens. It's really an argument about feminism rather than an argument about gender switching. But it's a very good book in any case. Another thing that science fiction writers can do is have creatures which have no gender themselves but can mimic humans. So, for example, in Camouflage, Joe Haldeman has a couple of creatures that are shape changers. They're aliens, they have no gender of their own, but they're surviving on Earth and they adopt human form. One of them tries out being male, tries out being female, decides that it prefers to be female because female humans appear to be nicer people. The other one tries out being male, thinks this is a good thing, I get to be in charge, I get to kill people, and yeah, you can see the argument that Haldeman is making here. Parasitology trilogy by Myra Grant is quite different. What she does in this is she has medical science invents a genetically engineered tapeworm that you can implant in your body and which will automatically put out all the drugs that you need to keep you healthy. Which is fine, except that the tapeworms have an agenda of their own. They discover how to get up into the brain, kill off the human, and take over the body for themselves. And at this point, they then have to behave as humans in society, particularly if they want to pass unnoticed. But they're tapeworms, they have no gender. Most of them simply copy the behaviour of the human that they've been hosted in. But one of them says, heck with this. I'm going to screw anything that moves because I'm a tapeworm and I don't care. So it manifests as a male human, but very effeminate and completely omnigendered and omnisexual. One of the most interesting series about gender, and probably worth a lecture all on its own, because it's been going for 20 years now, is the Rayflew series by Storm Constantine. It starts off with a post-apocalyptic world where a small number of humans have evolved into hermaphrodite creatures. They're initially made by a process called inception, which is a sort of mystical ritual, and they're made from human males, and they acquire vaginas. And over a series of many novels, Constantine explores this society. What would they be like as intelligent beings with their own social system? They discover that they are able to reproduce amongst themselves. A few books later, they start making Rayflew type things from human females as well as from human males. What does that do to the social dynamics and so on? So definitely worth taking a look there, but again, not particularly about actual trans people because these are evolved humans, not folk like us. Gender is obviously very much to do with politics. We live in patriarchal societies mostly, and a few writers have explored this idea. In Lois McMaster Bujold's Miles for Corsican series, the planet Bariar, where Miles lives, is very conservative and very patriarchal. And in the book A Civil Campaign, one of the minor characters called Lady Donna has political ambitions that she can't pursue because she's female. So she goes off and visits an alien civilization, has some gender treatment, comes back as Lord Dono, and gets on with her life, his life, and so on. So this really, again, isn't about a trans person. Bourgeois doesn't think much about the social and psychological complications of switching genders. It's simply a means of destabilising barrier society and poking fun at the idea of patriarchy. A slightly more nuanced example is the Tamir trilogy by Lynn Llewellyn, of which the first book is The Bone Dolls Twin. This is an epic fantasy series, and in it there's a prophecy that says the kingdom will only be safe if it's ruled by a queen. Now, an ambitious man manages to seize the throne, and he then goes around killing off all of his female relatives to make sure that nobody can put the queen in his place. When his sister gives birth to a daughter, the sister's husband hires a wizard to transform the baby girl into a baby boy to keep the child safe from the evil king until such time as it can grow up and claim its birthright. So we actually see this child growing up thinking that it's a boy and then eventually being told, no, actually you're a girl. There's a little bit more gender stuff in there, but to a certain extent it's quite convenient because the child has to grow up to be a warrior queen, and therefore it's kind of convenient that it's raised to be a boy and a knight and so on. Gender is also quite important in religion, and in Waking the Moon, Elizabeth Hand dramatises the conflict between patriarchal religion and matriarchal religion. So in the book, the world is secretly ruled from the shadows by a cabal of male wizards called the Benandanti. And as the book opens, the moon goddess sends an avatar into the world, a girl called Angela, who causes chaos and sacrifices lots of people and whatever. And the denouement of the book involves one of the characters undergoing a gender change from male to female as a sort of symbolic joining of the two forces and bringing things together to form a resolution. Some of you may be familiar with Donna Haraway's theories of woman as cyborg. I don't really have time to go into that tonight, but there are lots and lots of science fiction novels featuring female robots, female androids, female cyborgs, and so on. The two examples I've got here are steampunk stories, so they're female automata, clockwork beings. In The Alchemy of Stone, the central character, Mati, who is an automaton, her maker, Lothari, literally holds the key to her heart, because it's her heart where the clockwork spring is that keeps her going, and if he doesn't wind her up every morning, then she'll stop living. So we have characters like this in stories. The question is, are they actually women? Now, Haraway has a fairly intersectional attitude towards feminism and says, sure, all these things are women. But there's quite an interesting book that will be published later this year. The Gideon Smith series by David Barnett began with Gideon Smith and the Mechanical Girl. The Mechanical Girl is an automaton called Maria. Now, by book 3, she's in love with Gideon, because of course he's the hero, but she's convinced that he will never return her affections because she's an automaton, not a real human. And Barnett does something very interesting. He has Maria meet a trans woman, an actress called Gloria Munday, and the two become friends. They sit down in a coffee shop and have a little tete-a-tete and swap their ideas of what it means to be a real woman. I thought that was a fascinating example of using questions about trans people and the typical science fiction trope of the female automaton to examine what it means to be a woman. Now, men are always telling us that our brains are no good. And obviously, the fix for this is to give us male brains. One of the weirdest books about gender swapping is a late period Heinlein novel called I Will Fear No Evil. In this book, a rich old man called Johann Smith pays a doctor to develop the technique of brain transplants, so that when he dies, his brain can be taken out of his body and implanted into a fit young one. Unfortunately, when he dies, the only donor body that's available is that of his beautiful young secretary who's just been murdered by a mugger. So when he wakes up, it's not in the body of a handsome, athletic young man as he was expecting, but in the body of this beautiful woman. For reasons that Heinlein never quite explains, the mind, soul, whatever of the girl remains in the body and is there to help Johann learn to be a woman. And there's also a beautiful red-headed nurse, and there's lots of sex. It's a late period Heinlein novel. What can I say? So it's kind of weird, but it's kind of interesting as well, which I'll come back to in a minute. But there are quite a few stories, I think, of this type with men's brains being put into female bodies, and inevitably somebody wrote a story putting Hitler's brain into a beautiful woman's body, because it had to happen, basically. I've not read it myself. My friend John Clute assures me that it's there. There's also an Italian surgeon who reckons he's only about 2 years away from doing head transplants, and he thinks this will be a great boon to trans people. Now, brain transplants I could sort of understand, but head transplants? I don't think so. Anyway, let's get back to Heinlein. So the interesting question is this a trans person that we're talking about? And to a certain extent it is, because in the cross-dressing community there's this subgenre of fiction, this sort of fanfic type stuff called forced feminization. And the basic plot of a forced feminization story is that the hero, who is a man, is kidnapped by a domineering woman who forces him to dress as a woman. And initially, of course, he fights against it, but eventually he finds that it's quite enjoyable. And by the end of the story, he wants to dress as a woman for the rest of his life and also has great sex with this domineering female that's captured him. If you think about it, to a certain extent, that's the sort of story that Heinlein is telling in I Will Fear No Evil. And when I talk about my Hugos, I actually describe myself as the first openly trans person to win a Hugo, because I have my doubts about Mr. Heinlein. I have found a science fictional example of a forced feminization story. If you're interested in this stuff, you can find it on Amazon. Now, getting back to things more like the John Varley novel, plenty of science fiction writers assume that in the future gender will be a choice and people will make that choice. So here's an example from Alistair Reynolds. He's got this character, Zebra, who was assigned male at birth, spent a long time being male, and then suddenly decided not only to become female, but also to have body fur and to have it in a very cute zebra stripe. So, but why not? You can. People will do that. But of course you have to think about what that's going to do to society. My apologies to Al, but I don't think he really thought this through, and I'm going to compare him with Ian Banks, which I'm sure he won't mind, because Banks did think about this. And what Banks concluded was that if it was possible for people to change gender easily, and you had a sexist society, everybody would want to be male, because that's where the power and the money is. So if gender switching was easy and commonplace, either everybody would end up male, or society would evolve in some way that the sexism disappeared, and people didn't mind whether they were male or female. And being a good socialist, he assumed that society would evolve towards equality, which is what he has in the culture. So this quote here is taken from an essay that he wrote about his world-building process in designing the culture. Writers, of course, love a challenge, and one of the interesting things that you can do in a book is to write a character with no gender clues. Most of the time when you create a character, you'll give it a gendered name, will you describe what it's wearing, you'll describe mannerisms and so on, and it will be very obvious. Pronouns. Yeah? Most people have pronouns. So it'll be very obvious to the reader what gender that character is. But it is possible to write a story without any of those clues, and various people have done it. The Mars stories by Kelly Eskridge. Mars is the character. Those stories can be found in a collection called Dangerous Space. John Scalzi apparently has made quite a hobby of doing this. I haven't read all of this stuff, but apparently in the Android's Dream and the God Engines there are characters whose gender is never revealed. Now, the fact that a gender is not revealed doesn't necessarily mean that the character is non-binary, it just means it hasn't been specified. But in the best of all possible worlds, Karen Lord introduces a character, Leon, who is non-binary, and that's made quite explicit. Not only non-binary, but no gender at all. And then in the follow-up novel, The Galaxy Game, rather than go through the explanation again, Lord just does the do not specify gender for this character thing. Now, when gender switching became commonplace, of course, it came to the attention of various political groups, including the radical feminists. Now, this was back in the 1970s when gay liberation was getting going, and we had gay men and we had lesbian women, and never the twain shall meet. They hated each other. You could never have had an LGBT club at a university when I was there, because they'd have killed each other. Well, the lesbians would have killed the gay men because they were tougher. But if you have a society, a concept of biological essentialism like that, you're dividing society into men and women, then you have to have a firm division. You can't have people crossing between the two, because that makes a mess of the whole system. So the radical feminists were deeply, deeply suspicious of trans women. And they figured that either this was some sort of patriarchal plot to infiltrate the female utopia with sort of spies, or it was just the men figuring, well, the women have all gone off to have their own women world. We need to have somebody to screw, so let's make some women. And you can find this in a book called The Transsexual Empire by Janice Raymond, which is still quite influential today. But you can also find it in what is probably the most famous feminist science fiction novel ever written, The Female Man by Joanna Russ. Now that book has two separate societies, the female society and the male society. The women have worked out how to get pregnant without involving the men, and if they have boy children, they sell them to the men, who have no means of making children of their own. But the men aren't entirely happy with this, because they don't have any wives. So what they do is, when the male children are in school, they put them through macho-ness exams. Some of them fail slightly, and they're required as adults to dress as women, and they're used as diplomats and merchants to go and trade with the women, because of course a real man would never deign to actually speak to a woman, except to order her around. But about 1 in 7 of these boy children fail their macho exams so badly that they are put through gender reassignment, and they're raised to be sex slaves or wives to the powerful men. So it's absolutely the ideas of Janice Raymond put into a science fiction novel. Russ, to her credit, later in life apologised to the trans community for some of the things that she did when she was younger. She said she'd learned a lot in her life, but not all radical feminists have, and there are still plenty who adhere to those ideas. Another example of this sort of thing is Ilario by Mary Gentle. It's a complicated book because in many ways it's really admirable. It's one of the first books to feature an intersex character as the primary, the main focus point of the book. So that's Ilario. From that point of view, it's great. But there are 2 other gender variant characters in the book. One is Reckmeyer, who is a male eunuch and Ilario's best friend, and that's fine. The other one is Nephre, who is another eunuch, who is essentially a trans woman, right? And when Nephre is first introduced, there's no question that this person is a woman. But as soon as Reckmeyer explains the Nephre's history, then suddenly Ilario starts to notice the clues, because this person isn't real, this person is faking it and giving themselves away all the time. And then later in the book, it's revealed that Nephre has a relationship with a gay man and agrees to go back to living as male in order to carry on this relationship. So what Gentle is saying in this is that being intersex is a valid identity. Being an effeminate male eunuch is a valid identity. Being a gay man is a valid identity. But being a trans woman is fake. Being a trans woman is pretending to be something you're not. Being a trans woman is being a gay man who has gone too far. Understandably, I wasn't terribly happy with that book. But not every feminist writer is negative about trans people. One of my favourite books about gender switching is The Passion of New Eve by Angela Carter. In this book, it's set in America in the near future, and America's undergoing social breakdown. The central character is a caddish young Englishman called Evelyn, who's living in New York, has a relationship with a black girl, gets her pregnant, and then runs off and leaves her. He is unaware that the girl's mother is A, the leader of a black civil rights group, and B, a brilliant surgeon. And the mother's people kidnap Evelyn, and then she puts him through a gender reassignment and sends him out into the world as Eve to see how he gets on. Now, there's another character in the book called Tristessa Sardange, who is a Garbo-like Hollywood actress, impossibly beautiful, impossibly distant and desirable. And Evelyn, as a teenager, had a crush on this woman. So having been set loose in America, she then heads off to Los Angeles to try and find Tristessa, only to discover that this person is in fact a clever transvestite who has been fooling the world for years. So there's another interesting question between a possibly real and a possibly fake identity that's being examined here. But the interesting thing about it from my point of view is that Evelyn, or Eve as she becomes, is an actual trans woman. She's gone through the gender process, she's living in the real world as a woman and experiencing life as a woman, as opposed to Tristessa, who is much more of an artificial person. And therefore I think this book is much more friendly to trans women than, say, Ilario is. Now, science fiction writers were aware fairly quickly that being trans wasn't exactly popular with the general public. And there's another Heinlein book that I'd like to look at, because many trans people I know said that themes in it speak very deeply to them. It is in many ways a terrible book. In particular, there's an awful, awful rape and torture scene right at the beginning, which you need to be aware of if you're going to read it. And of course it's late period Heinlein, so it's flabby and full of right-wing politics and stuff. But Heinlein does something very interesting with this. Ostensibly the book is about test tube babies. It was written at the height of the test tube baby panic, and many of you will be too young to remember this, but there were serious articles being written in newspapers questioning whether a baby made in a test tube was really human. And Heinlein examines this question with Friday, who is a test tube baby, living artifact, artificial person, the sorts of words that are used about them. But he examines it in the way that he uses the discrimination, the insults that are thrown at trans people for being fake humans. Right? And the example here, talking about bathroom panic, for example. And Friday talking about there not being any country that she can go to that considers her a fit member of society. So the book actually does talk to trans people from that point of view. And I'm pretty sure that Heinlein must have known trans people in order to have written that. I think that there's a trans character in the book, and also at one point Heinlein has Friday go to California, which is a separate nation by that time. And being California, it's very progressive, and they've outlawed gender. Everybody is required to be completely androgynous, and poor Friday gets into terrible trouble asking where the ladies' toilet is. So yeah, Heinlein definitely had an interest in trans issues. Some writers also began to examine the process that trans people have to go through. And a really good example is Triton by Samuel Delany. I believe the reason that this was so good is that Delany was actually living in an apartment downstairs from a gender clinic when he wrote the book. So he saw lots of trans people going in and out, and he got to talk to them and learn about their lives. But the central character in the book, Brom, is a really, really bad example. If Brom were alive today, Brom would be a men's rights activist. Brom would be an enthusiastic supporter of Gamergate, because he's absolutely convinced that the single cis white male is the most oppressed type of humanity that there could possibly be. Why is he oppressed? Because women won't sleep with him. Try as he might, he cannot get a girlfriend. So he decides to get his own back. Now in our world, he might have gone out and bought a bunch of submachine guns and killed as many pretty girls as he could find, because people do that. But in the book, he has a different plan. He decides to go through gender treatment and become the most beautiful woman in the world, and then he will be the person who is able to deny sex to unfortunate men. And what's more, he can get his own back on all those women who slighted him by stealing their boyfriends. Now, understandably, Bron is as much a disaster as a woman as he was as a man, because it's him that's the problem, not the gender. Um, but the interesting thing about the book is that he's not the only trans character in it. There's another character who's a black man called Sam, which, you know, might possibly be a stand-in for the author, who is very successful, who is completely happy as a trans man, has a good career. In fact, he's a secret agent for the government, sort of James Bond type character. He has a family and so on. So Delaney is saying, look, okay, there are some odd things about this, but actually gender reassignment for some people can work really, really well. Another example is Mission Child by Maureen McHugh. The central character of that, Jana, is living in a war-torn world, and she disguises herself as a man in order to avoid being raped. And she discovers that being a man is actually a relatively easy thing to do. She's kind of comfortable with it. And when things settle down, she decides to investigate the possibility of gender treatment. Goes through the whole thing with the psychologist and eventually decides she's perfectly happy as she is as a female-bodied person living as male. I have a sneaking suspicion that when McHugh wrote this, she was saying that actually this is what trans people should do. You shouldn't bother with all that medical stuff. But it's not explicit in the book, and now it's actually quite a good example of somebody saying, well, you know, this is me. This is what I want with my life. And hopefully some non-binary people will be quite happy with it. Comics also start to explore the gender issues. In Camelot 3000, King Arthur and his knights are reincarnated in the far future to fight some new cosmic evil or whatever. And everything is going swimmingly except for poor old Tristan, who has been reincarnated in a female body. And Tristan is convinced that he's still a bloke, and he suffers from dreadful gender dysphoria, and also, of course, is misgendered by everybody, including the king. Now, I'm not terribly happy with the denouement of this, because again, we have this thing where the writer Mike Barr has the character Tristan become comfortable with the body and gets into a lesbian relationship with Isolde. So Barr is perhaps saying that this is what trans people should do, and I'm fairly sure it's what he meant because he did that in another comic with a similar character. On the other hand, the actual portrayal of the gender dysphoria I thought was pretty good, and anyway, Brian Bolland's art is beautiful, and I recommend the book on that ground alone. Alpha Flight is Marvel's Canadian superhero team. Now, as you're probably all aware, nobody ever dies permanently in the Marvel Universe. They die temporarily and they come back in some way. Well, one of the characters in Alpha Flight, Sasquatch, dies. Sasquatch was originally Walter Lankowski, and he comes back in a female body as Wanda. And this isn't a problem with the superheroine because Wanda can still transform into the Sasquatch thing and do the clobbering and all that sort of stuff. The only difference is that Walter was a brown Sasquatch and Wanda is a white one, because white ones are prettier or something like that. But poor Wanda has terrible trouble back in normal society. Walter was very rich, all of his money has gone to his widow, Veronica. She's not having any of this reincarnation as a woman. And they go to court and the judge laughs at her, right? Because, you know, that's clearly not Walter, in no way. So it is to a certain extent an example of the sort of social difficulties that trans people can go through, particularly if the courts are discriminating against them. Probably the best example of a trans character in a comic is from Neil Gaiman's Sandman series, The Game of You. And what Gaiman appears to be doing here is using the horror trope to demonstrate what terrible lives trans people can have, particularly back in the 1990s when he wrote this. So his central character, also called Wanda, has pretty much everything go wrong for her. She has fundamentalist Christian parents who reject her. Her best friends are good feminists and they're quite supportive, but they're also worshippers of the moon goddess, who turns out to be a radical lesbian feminist who hates trans people. And when the rest of the bunch go off and have an adventure, poor Wanda has to get left at home and eventually dies as a result. In addition, Wanda is very tall, she's very bulky and muscular. She has a phobia about hospitals, which means she can't go through surgery, and so on. Everything goes wrong. And yet, Wanda is tough. Wanda is absolutely convinced of her identity. Wanda is brave. Wanda is by far the most admirable person in the book. And so I think what Gaiman is doing here is trying to give his primarily cis audience an idea of the awful things that happen to trans people, and yet they still somehow keep themselves together. Wanda, of course, dies in the end, but at least when she dies, Death recognises her for who she is. And Death, of course, is the most important character in the Sandman series. So if you get the seal of approval from Death, that's okay. Of course, many trans people today still have the same problem that Wanda did, in that your parents, if they don't accept you, will bury you under your birth name. But okay, trans people are unpopular now, but might there be some way in which they become fashionable in the future? Well, here are a couple of examples. In 1995, there was a very famous paper by a biologist called Anne Foster Sterling, which said that humans basically have 5 genders, not 2. And this was used as the basis of a science fiction novel by Melissa Scott. The theory in Shadow Man is that in order to survive the rigours of interstellar travel, humans have to evolve in such a way that their 5-gendered nature becomes much more obvious. And the book is set on the one planet in the galaxy that has a deeply conservative government that insists that everybody has to identify as either male or female, despite the obvious gender queerness of human nature. So it's basically poking fun at the American government. In 2312, Kim Stanley Robinson speculates that intersex people might live longer than binary sex people. And if that was true, then rich people would have their babies genetically engineered to become intersex so that they could benefit from a longer lifetime. And then it would become fashionable and everybody who could afford it would do it. I have to admit that his intersex characters behave in a dreadfully gender binary way, so it's perhaps not the best implementation of that, but credit to him for coming up with the idea. Of course, why stop at 5 genders when you can have 7? Which is what Greg Egan does in Distress. He has N male and N female, which are natural males and females. There are uber males and uber females who are medically modified to be the exemplars of their genders. There are asexual people, and there's things called I males and I females that he doesn't really explain very well, but he says it's a new concept of gender, and I think might involve having an Apple logo tattooed on your neck or something. Egan's books are really, really good on the science, but they're very hand-wavian when it comes to the social stuff. Virtual worlds. On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog or whatever, and at the beginning of Charlie Stross's novel Glass House, we get introduced to a virtual world in which people can be whatever they want. If you want to be a purple-furred gay rhinoceros, you can be a purple-furred gay rhinoceros, and people do. However, in the book, the central character, Robin, who is this vicious mercenary type, is kidnapped and placed in a virtual world based on 1950s America, and he's forced to play the role of a 1950s housewife. Initially, he hates this, of course, and tries everything he can to escape from this. But there comes a point in the book which I threw a wobbly when I first read it, and that is that the bad guys brainwash Robin to believe that he is indeed a 1950s housewife. And the reason I got upset about that was because what Stross is essentially saying here is you can brainwash people out of their gender identity. And that is very, very dangerous because it's getting us into the whole area of gay cures and trans cures and so on. Gay cures, we definitely accept, don't work and are cruel and are being outlawed. Trans cures, unfortunately, despite the fact that they use the same techniques, are still being practiced in many places today. There's another example of a virtual world in Greg Egan's Diaspora, that again, he has these software people. There's one society in which they are all, in theory, asexual. Unfortunately, he blows this completely in the first chapter because he introduces 2 characters, one of whom has a male-coded name and male-coded behaviour, and the other of whom has a female-coded name and female-coded behaviour. So, nice try, Greg, but didn't work. Now, getting back to this question of fixing people, we know that gay cures and trans cures don't work in our world. Torturing people does not stop them being gay or trans. However, if medical science gets good enough, perhaps you could fix people in some way. And this is a question that Elizabeth Bear explores in the Jacob's Ladder trilogy. Jacob's Ladder is a generation ship, and for the first couple of books, we don't know too much about it. We're just introduced to this bunch of characters that are a complete riot of genderqueerness, at all sorts of different identities on board the ship. But in the third book, when the ship reaches its destination and finally reconnects with Earth's society, we discover that the ship was built by a political group called the New Evolutionists, who wanted humanity to be able to go away and evolve into more diverse forms, whereas back on Earth they had invented this process called right-minding, which forced everybody to conform socially to whatever the government wanted. So well done, Elizabeth Bear, for exploring those issues. Now, I've been quite dismissive of one or two people and their portrayals of trans people, but it is possible to get better with a bit of practice. And Ian MacDonald is a shining example of that. In the first novel to address trans issues, Sacrifice of Fools, it's actually primarily about putting a bunch of aliens down in Belfast in the middle of the Troubles to see what the rest of the people there make of it. Catholics, Protestants, aliens. But there's a subplot with a character called Eamon Donnan, who becomes obsessed with the aliens. He starts off going to secret clubs where you dress as an alien, and eventually he has medical treatment to make him look like an alien. And what MacDonald is doing here, of course, is looking at trans people and saying, doesn't matter how you dress, doesn't matter what medical treatment you have, you can never really be the person that you think you are. And understandably, a few trans people were a little upset with that. And MacDonald listened. And when he wrote River of Gods, he introduced a character called Tal, who is, in the world of the book, a newt, someone who has undergone gender reassignment to become free of all gender. And because Tal suffers discrimination in the same way that trans people suffer discrimination in our world, so clearly MacDonald here has looked at the issue, talked to trans people, and written a much more nuanced and sympathetic character. By the time we get to Brazil, whoa. The central character in the book, Edson, has a boyfriend, a sugar daddy, a rich old professor who likes to play superhero dress-up games. So he'll be Batman to Edson's Robin and so on. Also, Edson, he's Brazilian, he goes out dancing in clubs and whatever. When he does so in drag. And none of these things stop him from spending most of the book mooning over a pretty Japanese programmer girl that he meets early on. So completely riotously genderqueer, and it's done so well that most of the reviewers of the book don't even mention it, which, considering how often reviews say, ooh, there was a queer character in it, it completely put me off. It's really, really done well, so congratulations, Ian MacDonald. Mary Gentle, obviously, kudos to her. Her latest novel, The Black Opera, has a much more sympathetic portrait of a trans woman. Other people have written about binary and non-binary and intersex characters. Here are a few examples. Pantomime by Laura Lamb features an intersex character called Micah Gray. There's a sequel called Shadowplay as well. Those have been quite popular with the non-binary community. Courier's New Bicycle, sadly only available in Australia, but a marvellous portrait of a non-binary character. Identity not important to the plot or anything, it's just who this person is. And in Demon Knights, Paul Cornell has introduced the first intersex character in mainstream comics with The Shining Knight. There are a lot of YA books that touch on trans themes, but most of them appear to be written by cis people for cis people. And they're kind of like, there are these trans people and they're a bit weird, but it's sad and we should feel sorry for them. It's all very patronising. However, there are a few genre books with good portrayals. In Eon and Bayona, by Alison Goodman, the central character is a girl who dresses as a boy in order to become a warrior. But there's also a secondary character, Lady Della, who is a transsexual concubine and one of the Emperor's most trusted confidants. It's a really nice character that I'm very fond of. In The Coldest Girl in Cold Town, which is a vampire novel, Holly Black has a young trans woman. And she's from a poor background in America. She can't afford to go through gender treatment, so she decides to take herself off to the vampire town, Cold Town, while she's still a teenager, because then if she becomes a vampire, at least she will stop aging and won't get old and ugly. Interesting take on that stuff. The only middle grade book that I know of that touches on gender issues is Questers by Joan Lennon. It has 3 central characters, one a human boy, one a human girl, and one a young alien from a species that doesn't acquire a gender until puberty. The end of the book actually is that this alien person says, yeah, I think I've decided what gender I'm going to be. End. Beautiful. Comics. We've touched on some comics, but there are others featuring trans people. One of the most famous is Doom Patrol. There was a Vertigo series in 1993, around the same time that Gaiman was writing Sandman, and it was written by a trans woman called Rachel Pollack. This is her trans superhero, Coagula, also known as Kate Godwin. And in that particular frame, she's telling the story of how she tried to become a member of the Justice League. And apparently Superman, Batman and Wonder Woman really liked her powers, but they didn't want to work with a trans woman, so they kicked her out. I don't know if you can see the button here, but it says, put a transsexual lesbian on the Supreme Court. So Rachel had about a 2-year run on Doom Patrol featuring that character. There's lots of good stuff in there. The publicity for this talk featured frames from Gail Simone's run on Batgirl, where when Gail takes over the book, Barbara Gordon has decided to sort of go out on her own, and she looks for somewhere to live, ends up sharing a house with this girl called Alicia Yo, and that sort of carries on for about 18 issues or so. And then in issue 19, Barbara's come in one evening from a busy night of crime fighting and having escaped from the Joker and such, and has to do a little bit of confessional stuff, crying on Alicia's shoulder. And Alicia decides to return the favour and do her own confessional stuff and reveals that she's trans. And on the posters you've got the whole of the scene, and that's it. Okay, you're trans, fine, no problem. And a few issues later, the girls are out shopping for shoes and stuff together. So that was really, really well done, I thought. And by the way, Gail has been enthusiastically tweeting about this lecture. Thank you, Gail. More recently, Kieran Gillen seems to put a trans person in just about every book he writes. He takes the attitude that I have a diverse cast of characters. By the law of averages, one of them is probably trans. That one. Which is marvellous. Video games are a much more conservative branch of geek culture than books or comics, but even they are slowly moving in our direction. Quite a few games now allow you to choose the gender of the main character that you're playing, but as far as I know, there is only one which has a non-player character who is specifically introduced as a trans person, and that is Krem in Dragon Age Inquisition. Presumably we'll see more of that sort of thing in the future. Movies and television are, again, fairly conservative, but if you have a trans woman who is a high-profile Hollywood producer, all sorts of wonderful things can happen. And there is a new TV series in production, science fiction TV series called Sense8. It's being written by J. Michael Straczynski of Babylon 5 fame, and the producers are Lana and Andy Wachowski of The Matrix and Jupiter Ascending and so on. And of course, with Lana in charge, we're going to have trans women in it. This here is Jamie Clayton, who is a trans woman actress. She's playing the part of a superpowered trans girl called Noni Marks. The photo was apparently taken while they were filming on location in San Francisco. And I'm really looking forward to see what they've done with that series. Of course, if you're going to write books about trans people, then it helps to have trans people write them because they have the lived experience. And a really amusing book is Supervillains by Alicia Goranson. It's set in the queer community of Boston, and the basic plot is that the rich neoliberals decide to form a superhero team for nefarious purposes of their own, and the queers try to oppose them and accidentally get labelled as a group of supervillains. Much hijinks ensues. It's really entertaining. Also, Roz Caveney, well-known trans activist as well as a high-profile literary critic, she's currently writing a series called Rhapsody of Blood. And the basic idea there is that there's this magical rite whereby if you kill enough people, you will become a god. And we're sort of taken through history where various people try to perform this rite and get foiled by some means or other. And Roz, being a trans woman herself, has put a lot of trans people into the book. The most recent volume, volume 3 in the series, called Resurrections, has a very, very high-profile trans character indeed. And Roz, I believe, is a Catholic. I don't think the Pope has read the book. Because if he had, not only would she be excommunicated, she'd probably be in the deepest dungeons that the Vatican has. It's great. There are many other trans writers out there. Not all of them write trans characters because, hey, they're writing books and whatever, and they want to cover the whole spectrum of humanity, but some of them worth supporting, certainly. Rachel Pollack I've already talked about with Doom Patrol, but she's also an accomplished novelist, the first trans person to win the World Fantasy Award. Caitlin R. Kiernan writes mainly dark fantasy stuff. I think she's won a World Fantasy Award as well. She's certainly been up for it. The Drowning Girl, which she released recently, is one of my favourite books of all time. It's really brilliant, although of course a bit disturbing because it's dark fantasy stuff. Charlie Jane Anders edits the IO9 website, but is also an accomplished writer of short stories. And she's won a Hugo for one of those recently. She's got a novel due out fairly soon. Jack Wolfe, British trans man, has one novel out. It's called A Tale of Rawhead and Bloody Bones, and it's about fairies and the origins of medicine. And Billy Martin, formerly known as the horror writer Poppy Z. Bright. Billy hasn't written much since sorting his life out, but hey, as long as he's happy, then that's good. There are many, many others. Some of them are not so famous. Others I'm not sure that they want me to mention them in a public talk like this, so I'm not doing so. And I thought I would end by just having a look to the future and seeing what I would like to see in science fiction and fantasy. From a fantasy point of view, we know from history that there are many cultures where gender variance has been much more accepted than it is today. And I would like to see people setting fantasy stories in cultures like that. With science fiction, I'd like to see people picking up on what Le Guin has done and actually applying modern science, understanding how gender is actually created in bodies, and doing a lot more hard science about the whole gender changing stuff. And of course I want to see a lot more books in which trans people just happen to be characters. So the books are not about being trans in any way. It's just simply that they're an ordinary part of society getting on with their lives and being heroes and maybe even villains. But we've had enough of being villains. Thank you, J.K. Rowling. I saw Bethany Black tweeting about the silkworm yesterday. That was just awful. But there you go. Anyway, that's it. If any of you out there are writers, please have a go at some of this sort of stuff. I'd love to see what you come up with. And the rest of you, if you're readers, I hope you found a few books that you will find interesting and do enjoy.
To introduce myself, my name is Andy Sawyer, and I'm the Science Fiction Foundation Collections librarian for Special Collections and Archives at the University Library. And I'd like to, this isn't the official thanks, but I'd like to make a number of thank yous. And first of all, thank you for yourselves for coming along and listening to Cheryl. Thank you to Cheryl for giving a wonderful talk. I mean, I certainly learned a lot, and there are books that I will be going to read. There are authors that I will kind of look at a little bit differently, which is good. And thank you particularly for to Alan Greaves and the Flagship group for giving the library and the Science Fiction Foundation a chance to really kind of step forward and sponsor this event. And I think I'm very proud to have been involved with it, and I'd like to thank you. And certainly from the point of view of the library, special collections department, indeed all of the library, I think we are all very proud to have been involved with this event. So thank you for giving us the opportunity. I'd also like particularly just personally to thank my colleague who isn't actually here. Or are you here, Andrew? Yes. Andrew Barker from the head of academic liaison and special collections for his support over the last few days in helping me kind of front this, and thank you to the Vice Chancellor for coming along and introducing. And I've talked too much, so I'd like to open the discussion out to the people that matter, the audience, and perhaps Cheryl would like to take some questions. Thank you.
Alrighty, anybody out there? Don't all rush at once. Yes.
Do you think it can be problematic with representations of trans people in film, TV, books, when a lot of trans people seem to have very drastically different experiences themselves of the situation? So things like the TV show Transparent, some people felt very like that it felt connected to that, whereas other people felt might feel that it was too simplistic.
Just for the benefit of the recording, I'll repeat the questions. That question was about whether it's problematic putting a trans character in a story when there are so many different types of trans characters, trans people with very different experiences. And yes, I think absolutely it's a problem. When authors come to me and ask my advice about putting trans characters in their books, I always say have more than one. Because firstly, trans people don't exist in a vacuum. There are support groups and whatever, so they probably know other trans people. But by having more than one, you have the ability to demonstrate that you understand that there are different types of trans people and that you're not saying they are all like this.
Any more questions?
Yes.
Yes, Emma.
Hi. I wanted to ask really about, mostly because I'm a big Ursula Le Guin fan, and I wanted to kind of sort of go a bit more in depth into the whole Left Hand of Darkness thing, and ask you, have you looked at other stories set on Gethin, like Coming of Age in Carhide, where she does manage to write about that society without using any gendered pronouns to describe the main character, and it's kind of much less a case of Genly I sees these characters as male and then has to see them as female, and much more, these gender is not a thing here.
Yeah, we're essentially talking here about the evolution of Ursula Le Guin as a writer. That when she wrote Left Hand of Darkness, she opted to describe the Gathenians using male pronouns because male was the default if you didn't know what gender somebody was. And people pointed out to her that this was a rather sexist thing to have done, and she accepted that, and eventually she produced a book in which she's describing the Gathenians in much more gender neutral. So it's a short story, not a book, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but first of all, she described them with female
yeah.
pronouns in the very first story. So it was less of a this is because it's the default, and more sort of challenging the default by using it and making the character have to question it.
Yeah. So yeah, Le Guin certainly has thought a lot about this since she wrote the book originally. And that's a good thing, and I wish more writers would do that. I mean, we've seen Joanna Russ perhaps not produce any new books, but certainly evolve in her thinking. We've seen Ian MacDonald evolve in his thinking. So, yeah, great to them. Thank you for doing that. Yes.
You spoke there about you have been asked about appropriate ways of portraying characters who are trans in books, and you said one of the things that you often advise is to have more than one. But what other bits of advice do you give to someone who wants to include characters who are trans, but perhaps as a big flag over it.
Okay, so the question is about what advice do I give to writers who want to put a trans character in the book. Generally what happens is that people don't come to me and say what I should do. They come to me and say, look, I've written this stuff, can you have a look at it and see if I've done anything awful? So what I will be doing then is picking apart the things that might be problematic. What I do tell them is that they will never please everybody, because there's a wide variety of different trans people, and not everyone will see themselves represented in that book. Not everybody will you'll like the portrayals, and there's a lot of internal infighting amongst the trans community, because people are always looking for validation for their identities. People want to believe that they're not crazy, and they have all these doctors and journalists telling them that they're crazy, so they like to have something to hang on to say what I'm feeling about myself is okay. And when they see other people in the same community expressing their identity in different ways, then that can be disturbing for some people. So there is a lot of disagreement in the trans community, and much of that is because trans people are extremely varied, which is entirely understandable. So I do tell people that they can never please everyone. I also, as I said, tell them to have more than one if they can, to avoid cliches, obviously. Certainly to avoid the cliche of having the trans person being a murderer. And also to fill the character in a bit. Don't just say this is a trans person, but to have a genuine personality to this person. And not make being the trans the reason for having them in there. Have them in there as a character who happens to be trans and has other interesting things about them as well. Any more questions? Yes.
Well, you said that you advise that they cannot please everyone. Do you think that this may discourage some people of trying to write about trans people, and that may cause a problem because of the underrepresentation in literature?
There will always be some people who will be concerned about attempting things like this, and to a certain extent, I mean, not just trans people, but gay people, people of colour, and so on. We can occasionally be our own worst enemies by going after people on Twitter, but it's writers' jobs to try to write about people who are different from themselves, particularly if you're a science fiction writer or a fantasy writer. You're trying to set stories in other worlds about aliens or elves or whatever. It's your job to try and understand what other people are like. And most authors know that they can't please everybody. Because you write a book and 9 out of 10 people love it to pieces, and the other 10% hate it and send you death threats. So they understand that this is all part of the process. They just have to understand that when they do trans people, they won't find every trans person immediately supporting the book and saying that, wow, that was brilliant. And they mustn't take me as being representative of all trans people. I can't speak for non-binary people because I'm not non-binary. I can't speak for trans men because I'm not a trans man. Yeah, I'm back there.
This is probably a really stupid question and probably has nothing to do with anything. But what do you think of gender stereotypes concerning animals? Like, for example, dogs are for boys and cats are for girls.
What a good question. So the question is about gender stereotyping of animals, like cats being female and dogs being male. I was actually thinking about this on the train on the way up, because I came up through Crewe, and there's this heritage yard in Crewe with a whole bunch of old stuff. And they had a bunch of carriages in a blue livery with the logo, the Great Britain, on them. And all of these carriages were named after great British people, and they were all men. And it's the only time I've ever seen carriages with male names. Thomas the Tank Engine, all of the carriages are female. So I was actually thinking about the way that we do that. It is really quite interesting, and I think that people could write lots of academic papers on that subject. It's not something I've been thinking about for this paper, but for this lecture. But now that you've raised the issue, I want to go away and think about that and read a few books to see what I can come up with. Yes, sir.
You've had some lovely examples of writers who've improved and developed nuance. And where a writer can go back and edit their previous novel and say, actually, I got that really wrong, let me do it again. With video games, you can have new content introduced. So have there been any examples of games that have changed in response to a community and offered new content in a short period of time?
It's a question as to whether any video games have changed in response to community input. And I have to say I don't know. I was briefly a video games programmer back in the days of the Sinclair Spectrum, which all of you are too young to remember. But I don't actually play video games because I am a complete klutz. You know, I can't get through any of the action sequences, so I'm not an expert on these things. I'm afraid I'm going to have to pass on that one, but good question.